Hello and welcome to the June edition of Hocus Focus. I'm Sara Mondaini.
And I'm Thomas Sheridan.
And once again, we're thrilled to have you join us as we look into two more fascinating topics from the world of the Fortean and Unexplained. But right before we get into all that, I just want to extend a heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you for your support of the show. And your love of Hocus Focus just gears us up to continue making these episodes, and you guys make Hocus Focus special. And I do have a request actually for those who haven't subscribed to the channel yet. And as I said, I was so happy that many of you are enjoying the show, but the channel analytics are showing me that 50% of our Hocus Focus viewers are not yet subscribed. And by subscribing, you stay updated on all the latest Fortean offerings, and you play a really important part in helping my channel grow and thrive. So if you haven't already, just please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell and become a part of our ever-expanding community of Fortean fans and help spread the wonder of Hocus Focus and the Wuthering Nights channel and the Beyond Room 313 channel far and wide. And also, one last thing before I hand you over to Thomas. Stay tuned to the end because Thomas and I have an exciting announcement about our book at the end of this month's episode. So Thomas, how are you and how's life been treating you since we last got together last month?
Yeah, pretty good. I've been keeping busy myself. The weather's been really good. And I've been doing a few things to keep myself out of trouble. And I can't really complain, really. The stats of 50% is actually not unusual. In fact, I read somewhere recently that most YouTube channels, 33% of the people are only subscribed. So you're doing well by standard numbers. But yeah, everyone should get subscribed because there's other things other than focus on Sarah's channel. So do that. And yes, the books. Well, the book announcement at the end of the show, you got to stay tuned for that because it's a good one.
Yes.
It's not just the publication date; it's a little bit more than that.
Anyway, without further ado, let's jump into tonight's first topic. And in past episodes, you'll recall that we've talked about the hinterlands that surround towns and cities and how they can affect sensitive people who live on the outskirts of them, and how that they're sometimes like a Belisha beacon for entities to hang around and harvest energy from the local people who live there. And one part we haven't discussed is the sandy hinterlands of the desert. And why are these barren landscapes also full of reports and stories of ghosts, spirits, and high strangeness? Perhaps it's something about the environment or the way that humans interact with it that make these areas prone to supernatural occurrences, and it's definitely a worthy topic for discussion on Hocus Focus. And we know deserts are vast and dry and isolated and possibly one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, making them really natural graveyards for those who succumb to them. And although deadly, they do have a beauty of their own as well, with the stunning sunsets and this strange flora and fauna. Now, over the years, ancient burial grounds have been found in some of these barren places, which have been untouched for centuries, and bones of people who've died there, buried deep underneath the sand, have been discovered over the years. The desert, just like its polar opposite, the sea, has had many tragedies and it's swallowed up the bodies of many people. And I've mentioned in a previous episode regarding the high strangeness of the oceans and seas that those burial grounds have not been consecrated, and so disturbing them is believed to awaken the spirits of the dead. And I've got one such story to tell you about, which I'll go into in a bit more detail in a moment. Now, with the wars and foreign infiltration of the native people, many of these ancient burial grounds in the desert have been unknowingly disturbed, which is why they're believed to be haunted by ghosts and entities. And deserts are also full of history and folklore with ancient civilizations, leaving their mark with artifacts and legends. And there's lots of tales about vengeful spirits seeking retribution and tales of the jinn lurking in the shadows and caves. Now, Aleister Crowley went to the desert to perform magical rituals and for the evocation of demons, and I believe that you had to go to the Middle East in order to summon up Choronzon, and that's exactly what he did in November 1909, along with his friend Newberg, and they travelled to Algeria. And during the trip, he invoked the 30 angles of Enochian magic with Newberg as the scribe, and he also performed an evocation to Choronzon. So Crowley knew there was a lot more to the desert in terms of jinn and what resides there. So there really is a lot to unpack with this one. And I've got a couple of reports of strange happenings in the desert, stories of jinn, cursed land, and why we think these places are a haven for supernatural entities. In particular, the jinn, which I'll talk about more later. So I'm going to kick off tonight's report with my first story of high strangeness in the desert, which is the haunted observation post in Afghanistan called Point Rock. So I've just got it here. And in 2009, at Helmand Province, an eerie phenomenon unfolded at Observation Post, or OP Rock, as it's known, leaving American soldiers bewildered and shaken and convinced that they had unleashed a curse. Now, OP Rock served as a crucial vantage point for coalition forces, offering strategic surveillance of insurgent activities in the region. Now, usually, observation posts are quite high up, but this one was lower, and so it had trenches dug around it so they could stand in them and look without being shot at. And when American soldiers arrived for their 60-day stay at the post, they wondered why the British soldiers, who they were relieving, couldn't get out of there fast enough, and warned them that if they go digging around to make sure that they put back whatever they find back in the ground. So the American soldiers disregarded this and found that the British soldiers hadn't dug the trenches deep enough to stand in without being seen. So they started to dig them deeper. And as they were digging, they found a metal stake full of Russian writing, a lot of pots and ceramics. And then, as they went a bit further down into the sand, they discovered dozens of human skeletons. And it seemed as though the observation post was standing on top of a burial ground. The 8 US soldiers were on a 60-day stay at OP Rock, and all of them reported strange encounters of eerie whispers, strange Russian voices on their encrypted radios, and shadowy figures darting between boulders under cover of darkness, but seen through the night vision goggles and infrared scanners. Then, when they went to set up to shoot, the figures would disappear, and one kept appearing closer every time the soldier put his goggles back on, until eventually it actually tapped him on the shoulder, and when he turned round, there was nothing there. They described feeling an oppressive presence and experienced severe temperature drops and footsteps sounding on the roof, but there was nobody there. And eventually, on their last day there, day 59, they heard shooting, machine gun fire, and the sound of bombs whistling in the air, and they thought that they were under attack. But again, they couldn't see where it was coming from, and they couldn't see anybody there. And it went on for a while, and then eventually, just as mysteriously as it started, it stopped, and the men lay there for hours expecting it to start up again, but it never did. And there was no damage and no evidence of any attack ever taking place against them. Now, when they finished their stint at Observation Rock, a couple of the soldiers went on to be killed in action later on during the conflict, and a couple more were severely injured, which led the surviving members to think that they might have unleashed some kind of curse when they dug the trenches and unearthed all those bones, and they suddenly understood what the British soldiers had meant when they had warned them to put back everything that they'd dug up immediately. Now, in the 80s, the Russians captured OP Rock and killed all the Taliban. And then the Taliban took it back and killed all the Russians. And eventually the Americans came and killed the Taliban. So that area where the observation post is standing has seen mass slaughter over the years. And there's also talk amongst the locals there that the area is cursed due to precious stones and heritage being stolen by invading soldiers from the local shrine in the Amir Aga village. And the locals say that these stones were put there because they were protective amulets for the people that live there. Now, I'd say the area is a place of what is known as psychogeographical animism, where lots of layers of supernatural activity have built up due to the atrocities that have taken place there, from ghosts to jinn, which I'll go into in a moment. Now, there's lots of reports of high strangeness in that area, and we could fill a full episode on just that one place. So I'm going to just quickly move on now to another desert scape, and that is the Farafra Desert, also known as the White Desert, which is located in western Egypt. And one of the legends associated with this desert is the story of the ghost of Akhenaten, who was a pharaoh who ruled during the 18th dynasty in ancient Egypt. And he was notorious for his attempt to introduce a monotheistic religion, which was centered around the worship of the sun disk, and to reject the traditional polytheistic beliefs of ancient Egypt. Now, this story goes according to the legend that Akhenaten's radical religious reforms angered the followers and priests of the traditional Egyptian gods, particularly Amun-Ra. And when Akhenaten died and his reign came to an end, his successors sought to erase his memory from history, and his city, Akhetaten, which is modern-day Armenia, was abandoned and forgotten about. According to the legend, Akhenaten's radical religious reforms angered followers and priests of the traditional Egyptian gods, particularly Amun-Ra, and when Akhenaten died and his reign came to an end, his successors sought to erase his memory from history, and his city, Akhetaten, modern-day Armenia, was abandoned and forgotten about. Priests who were unhappy with him are said to have cursed him to wander in the desert after his death, and he still seems to be wandering there under the curse. Reports of encounters with Akhenaten's ghost in the Farafra Desert have been made by numerous tourists, nomads and locals over the years. Reports of a spectral figure dressed in ancient Egyptian attire and feelings of being watched or followed as they explore the desert. So although his ghost seems to be unharmful and possibly a residual haunting because there's no interaction or communication made by him, it is creepy enough to scare the shit out of the travellers in the desert. And for this reason, many locals avoid the Farafra Desert and they don't go in there alone at night. Now, another thing that I found, deserts contain quartz, and this could be a big reason why they're a hotbed for strange activity. And quartz is known for its ability to amplify energy. And in a desert landscape where the conditions are already very extreme and the energy levels are very intense, the presence of quartz might amplify that even further. And it also has piezoelectric properties, which means it can generate electric potential under mechanical stress. And in a desert environment where shifting sands and tectonic movements occur every day, quartz crystals may release a burst of energy during the geostress and become a magnet for supernatural activity. And deserts have witnessed many, many traumatic events, from battles, accidents and natural disasters, which can leave footprints that hang around long after the events have happened. And ghosts associated with these traumatic events may be drawn to the residual energy imprints that are hanging around there. But as I previously said, in cases of residual energy, there's usually no communication or interaction. It's just a recording that's being replayed. So that would rule out the events at OP Rock in Afghanistan, as the men there experience being watched and touched by paranormal beings. And we've also talked before that jinn reside in caves and dark places. And some of the phenomena in the eastern deserts may be due to jinn encounters. And some, I believe, don't take too kindly to foreign invasion of their terrain, whereas others are bad entities who are looking to feed off the energy and create a perpetual cycle of fear. And I think deserts are a haven for these entities, and the vast areas of land are covered in ley lines and vortices, and I think that could also house gateways to other worlds, both in and out. So, Thomas, what do you think about the desert?
That first story about the American troops in Afghanistan on the mass graves is a fascinating one. And there's also the potential of, like, if you were a kind of an entity that didn't want to be near human beings, next to the bottom of the ocean, the best place to do that would be the desert. Now, you look at a few years ago, I don't know now, I flew over the Middle East to Dubai. And what struck me was that once, you pass over places like Baghdad and you'd look down and it was just blackness forever. There was just nobody living there. And you might see the odd oil fire from the oil fields, but nothing. And you come into, or you're coming out of it, or coming into Abu Dhabi, and you can see the city there, and it's just sitting there on the edge of the Red Sea. And beyond it is literally nothing. The Arabian desert, which is about the size of Europe, and it's all desert and it's empty. Now, not only is that that vast Arabian desert the place really where people considered like the jinn to be like central to its actual its state, its cultural, social, psychic state, it would make perfect sense why if they wanted to retreat from humans. Now, that desert is so vast that if you're in the middle of it, like right when Crowley and Neuberg went into the Algerian Sahara, remember you have the most incredible vista of stars. You literally have, in the case of Crowley and Neuberg, it would have been just like the illustrations of the goddess knew it, literally stars from horizon to horizon, and that would not be normally visible anywhere else in the world other than the middle of the ocean. So you're in a very hyper intensive place. The stars are intense. The climate is intense. It can be boiling hot in the day, freezing cold at night, and it would be generative not only for folklore and paranormal experience, but things like magic as well. And the desert attracts dangerous people as well. There's lots of stories of the American desert having cults and so on. I've heard like really spooky stories of people who are traveling across like parts of the Mojave Desert and encountering these like weird communities of hippies and people go missing and murdered. Death Valley is in the Nevada in the desert. Sorry, not Nevada. Is in the Western Desert and of the U.S. and that's associated with all kinds of phenomena as well, such as the moving rocks, which I don't think the basic explanation of them being blown around makes a lot of sense to me, due to like hydrofoiling. Some of these rocks are fairly large, and the desert would amplify. That's the impression I got over with the Arabian desert. It would amplify the senses, and you would, especially if you had a moon. It's really no surprise that the moon is so central into to not only Islam but also Middle Eastern religions, paganism, folklore, and the desert is seen as the echo of the moon, the mirror of the moon. That this concept that the moon and the desert are the same thing, and so you have a very strong lunar worship cult within that part of the world. So the desert, when you think about it, is really a natural version of the kind of environments that many magicians seek to create in order to do magical rituals. You get it there as soon as the sun goes down. As soon as the sun goes down, it's available to you just by the natural state of the place. And it does have a strange energy about it as well. I've never been deep into the desert, but I've just being on the outskirts of it. You could looking into the vastness of the Arabian desert. My mind just ran away with itself. What's out there? You could believe, that the mad Arab was out there writing the Necronomicon and this kind of thing. And the desert it's a tremendous canvas for paranormal events as well, because there's not much to interrupt you. There's the sand, and then there's the stars. So if there's strange lights in the sky or any kind of strange phenomena in the desert itself, you will notice it much more than say you would notice it in say a forested landscape, that kind of thing, or a landscape with it's quite diverse. in the same way you get a lot of that kind of folklore in icy landscapes and this kind of thing. So the desert paranormal Fortean thing has a vast amount of literature connected to it. I was looking up the other day from the Arabic world. A lot of stuff, unfortunately, is not translated into English, which is a great shame, I think. But I think there's a lot of stuff out there that is both, it relates to three things. You have magic, you have Fortean, and you have folklore, and all three are amplified by the stark contrast of the landscape there, the sheer starkness of it. So, the desert is a kind of a natural magic circle in many ways. And it would be very surprising that there wouldn't be this paranormal stuff. Now, regarding the American troops in the desert, uh, that's a fantastic story. It's the first time I've ever heard it. But I have heard lots of stories from people who served in the Gulf War One and Two, and they told me that you see all kinds of weird things in the desert. These are personal stories told to me, and they saw strange lights, and they would look through their night vision goggles and see human-like shapes moving very strangely across the desert, and they would turn on their huge, powerful lights, and there'd be nobody out there. So it's almost like it's not only is the paranormal more accessible in the desert landscape, but the paranormal is stronger, if that's the right word to use. It's more intensive in the desert landscape too. You want to, very few fellows who've served in the NATO forces in the desert, or even many people who worked in the oil industry, and they've been out there camping or whatever, or just getting that. Very few of them will come back and not have stories of seeing ghosts or weird things. In fact, we can only imagine what the story when the Russians were there, because that was a very brutal war, the 1980 war against the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, where the Russians got beaten. Basically, it was their Vietnam, and left a terrible psychic shock on the culture of Russia. They'd never been beaten like that before, and so I'm not surprised that there was a Russian grave under there, and from the war with the Mujahideen from those years, because that must have been pretty intense being out there. Could you imagine like being young men from cold Russia suddenly finding yourself in the barren desert like that at night? It changes you. It change. I often wondered if so many people come back badly affected from serving in those wars, and both the NATO ones, like Gulf War One and Two, if that a big part of it was the actual nature of the place amplifying their own psychic states, that everything became incredibly intense. It's just a phenomenal subject, and it never really interested me until I saw the Arabian Desert firsthand, and then I realized, now I know why all that stuff that goes on out there.
H.P. Lovecraft said, didn't he, we weren't meant to venture far, and he was talking about outer space. And we've used that analogy when we've talked about the sea. And I think it's the same for the desert. It's so extreme. I don't believe that it's meant for human habitation and for humans to be going around there. It's like the terrestrial version of outer space, and like the fairies who have a finite life, and the fairies like to keep themselves to themselves in the forests, the glens and the hills, and they don't want you humans interacting with them. They don't want anything to do with us. I also think that the jinn don't want anything to do with human interaction either, and that is their habitat, where they come from, where they live, where they reside, or where the gateway is between their world and ours.
There is that famous cave in Saudi Arabia, and I think there's another one in Yemen that are associated with the jinn living in the center of the earth. And not the locals, but I mean the people who live in that part of the world take this cave very, very seriously. That these caves where the jinn live very seriously. So yeah, I mean that's out there, and there's a reason why Lovecraft made, Al has read the compiler of the Necronomicon for that reason. A lot of the books of Western occult magic actually have their origin in Middle Eastern Arabic magic, and a lot of that came from those desert regions. It's like as if supernatural protection was needed by travelers across the desert because, as you said, we're not meant to go there. So you would have situations, for instance, like the so-called, like he's called the demon Paimon within the Goetia, but the fact is Paimon was almost certainly was a pagan Semitic god, whose primary purpose was to protect and aid travelers across the desert in caravans. So it has a long history of, before even Islam, of this notion that you needed spiritual protection when you went through the desert. So that's, when Crowley and Neuburg invoked the 12 angles of Enochian, that was the spiritual protection, because that's why the only place you could get Qurans on to manifest in physical form, it can manifest anywhere. And well, in physical form, it was the desert for that reason. It may even be a kind of a guardian spirit of the desert, if you know what I mean, like an actual, folk spirit of the desert, not necessarily just a demon. And its vicious, ferocious nature would be the vicious, ferocious nature. It would be animism of the desert, the animism of the desert. Think of it that way: the vicious, ferocious nature of the desert, and also the kind of thing of babbling. When people are going through the desert and they have heat stroke or dehydration, they start babbling before they die. They start having strange conversations with nobody and just babbling, and then they die in the desert. And that could be the babbling part of Quran's brought into kind of like spiritual form. So the desert is a remarkable place for this stuff.
That's really, I hadn't thought about that. Entities that reside there taking on the aspects of the environment. It's a very inhospitable place.
If you take Abrahamism out of the equation, right, you're left with animism. So it makes a lot of sense.
Same with the fairies, because they're very nature oriented, and they care about the environment, and they don't like people littering and desecrating the land. But if you don't do that and you respect the land, then they tend to leave you alone if you leave them alone. But in the desert, it's much more inhospitable. There's no life there, really. People don't live in the middle of the desert like they live in the middle of fairy circles and fairy places. Like islands full of them, isn't it?
Yes, and there's also the oasis as well. The oasis can be incredibly abundant, producing fruit like dates and other things at a phenomenal rate, just around a small pool of water in the middle of nowhere, which is when Europeans first came across these places. That's where the whole thing of, like, you need water to survive. Look how in the middle of this life flourishes. You often wonder too if the oasis could be a lure, that there are entities in the oasis that set it up in such a way to bring the humans in to prey on them or something like that.
Like
Like a kind of
fascination.
an Arabian version of a Selkie or a water nymph.
Yeah.
And the mirages, you get most incredible stories of people who've worked in the desert. I've known that have been in the oil industry, and it's just the mirages just aren't only shimmering lights that look like the sea. When you're in the desert that long, your mind plays incredible tricks, and you see cities and everything.
And if you want to take it to the other side of the world, the deserts in the western side of the world in America, like the Mojave Desert, there is civilization and lots of life on the outside, on the outskirts of those deserts. Like in Nevada, you've got Las Vegas, which is bang in the middle, but it also attracts lots of crime and hiding bodies in the desert and driving. I went to Las Vegas a long time ago for a long weekend, and the tour guide, I was actually making a joke, not to go hanging around those areas at night time, and he was referring to the movie Goodfellas and things like that, and being driven up there in the back boot of a car and dumped. But I think there's a lot of truth in what he was saying. There's lots of people driven up there with a bucket and spade, bashed on the back of the head, and put in a shallow grave and never seen again. So even in the places where there is towns and cities on the outskirts, they seem to attract a certain type of person.
Very much so. And this is a topic we have to come back and visit again, because I'm determined to get some good English language sources. There's also a lot of books and French books, the French language, on the ones that are out there on the desert don't seem to have they're more like folklore stories. I would like to get my hands on some English translations of Arabic Fortean books about the desert. And don't forget Area 51 that was in the desert, the Nevada desert. Don't forget it. Don't forget all the UFO sightings and so on. Don't forget Crowley and Parsons going into the deep into the Mojave Desert to do the Babylon working. That was their own kind of tribute to the Neuberg and Crowley event, and the they did invoke Babylon, and they did create the Moonchild, and through Marjorie Cameron, who ironically was I believe the first person in the United States to make an official police report of seeing a UFO, which is just remarkable stuff. So that's what the desert does. It amplifies Fortean and paranormal experiences.
Yes, and also two of the world's major religions are straight out of the desert, aren't they, as well?
Yep, yep. And another one Parsons did was accidentally summoned a fire elemental in Aurora Seco in Pasadena, so on the edge of the desert as well too. So it goes on and on and on.
So that is the first topic for tonight, high strangeness of the desert. And have you ever visited the desert, maybe on holiday or on vacation, or perhaps you are or were a member of the armed forces and you've been stationed out in the desert? Have you got any stories of high strangeness and paranormal goings on that you'd like to share with us in the comments? Please do. We'd be very interested to read them. Maybe we've got people watching who live in a desert area on the outskirts. Have you got any stories of strange goings on? Please put it in the comment, share them with others so we can all have a look. For this week's folk horror, we are reviewing Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula from 1993, starring Gary Oldman and an all-star ensemble cast. And it's a gothic horror film that follows Bram Stoker's classic novel, but it adds its own unique twists in the story. And it begins in 1462 when the nobleman Vlad Dracula, played by Gary Oldman, returns from battle to find his beloved wife Elizabetha, played by Winona Ryder, who's committed suicide upon hearing false reports of his death. So he's enraged and heartbroken, and he renounces God and becomes a vampire, swearing to seek revenge on humanity. And centuries later, in 1897, solicitor Jonathan Harker, played by Keanu Reeves, travels to Transylvania to assist Dracula in purchasing an estate in England. But he soon realises that Dracula is not what he seems, and he becomes a prisoner in his castle. And meanwhile, Dracula sets his sights on Mina Murray, also played by Winona Ryder, who is, in this adaptation, Elizabetha's reincarnation, and her friend Lucy, played by Sadie Frost. And as Dracula makes his way to England, hiding on the Demeter, he begins to prey on Lucy, turning her into a vampire. And Professor Van Helsing, played by Anthony Hopkins, and two of Lucy's suitors come together to try to save Lucy from the vampire threat. And Dracula deals with his eternal curse, and Mina struggles with her feelings for him, and it leads up to a tragic end as the two characters confront their inner demons and the darkness that threatens to consume them. And Gary Oldman, I thought, played Count Dracula beautifully, and he goes back and forth between the seductive charm and the awful depravity of the character. And part of me wanted him to win his beloved Mina back because he had so much more charisma, I thought, than Jonathan Harker had, who I found to be quite a weak and boring man. And all this story is set in the backdrop of Transylvania and Victorian England, and every scene is full of gothic beauty and the macabre. And the reincarnation of Mina shows how the souls of Dracula and Elizabetha are destined to be together across time and space. And I thought it also added a sad dimension to Dracula's character because he's tormented by the possibility of redemption through Mina's love, but in the end, he's eaten up by his own darkness. Now, cinematically, it was beautiful with deep colours and costumes, and I loved the transitions from one part of the story to another, where they used this like telescopic black hole transition, which worked really well and made it almost comic book like. And I thought it was a really clever use of a transition, because you have to be really careful with transitions when you're editing, because they can make a production look really bad if they're overused or they're over the top. And Francis Ford Coppola didn't want to use any kind of elaborate special effects or computer trickery when he made this film. So all the effects were achieved with practical and in-camera methods, and the blue flames seen on the road to the castle is the only optical effect in the film, and every other effect was achieved completely in camera on set with no post-production effects or anything. So it's a 9 out of 10 for me, and I've took a point off because I didn't like Jonathan Harker in this adaptation, and I'm not a big fan of Keanu Reeves. I just don't think he brought much to the film. But the movie is a timeless classic, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. Very romantic, very gothic. It's got everything. Perfect.
I 10 out of 10, shamelessly, one of the greatest films ever made, in my humble opinion. I rated up there with The Godfather 1 and 2, and also Francis Ford Coppola, and also The Wicker Man and Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's astoundingly good, and I'm going to address that one missing point with Jonathan Harker. I thought Keanu Reeves played the part perfectly, because Jonathan was a Victorian soy boy. That's how he would be. He was flat. His personality was one dimensional in many ways. And this was to make you understand, well, we all know the girls love a bad boy. Why Mina chose Dracula over John. Well, if you haven't seen the film, well, there's something wrong with you if you haven't seen the beginning. But like, if you haven't seen it, I don't care about the spoiler alert. She chose Dracula in the end. Gary Oldman worked that role like a feckin' rock star. All of it, the tripartite Draculas, the Vlad the Impaler at the beginning, the Mr. Burns in the castle during the transaction, and then finally as the kind of like rock and roll vampire in London, Victorian London. He was sensational, and so was just about every member of the cast. And I will also include your boyfriend Keanu Reeves in that as well, because he was playing what Bram Stoker in real life was kind of like. He was a civil servant, and my God, whoever wrote this with Francis Ford Coppola did their homework. There's all kinds of little cameos and interesting bits in it, like when he's in Victorian London. There's a sandwich board man walking around the Drury Lane Theatre District, and it says Hamlet starring Henry Irving. Now, Bram Stoker was Henry Irving's theatrical agent, and Henry Irving was the biggest star in the world at the time, and Bram Stoker kind of had this kind of repressed homosexual a desire for him, and Irving was a notorious womanizer, and it's believed that that aspect of the Dracula, preying on women thing, was actually based on his life around Henry Irving. I mean, you could put me in front of that film, and I could go by minute pointing out what makes it fantastic. Yes, you're right. It's absolutely luscious. As a straight man, I normally despise love stories in films. This one, actually, I got it. Oh, so that's what women are into. That's why they like it. I'm also a straight man, and I thought Anthony Hopkins was phenomenal and kind of incredibly sexy as his own version, to women. I mean, I could see that. I remember reading years later that Winona Ryder said all the women in the movie fell in love with him, had crushes on him that were working on the movie. And yeah, he was a guy. He was in his 60s, I think, then, but he played Van Helsing very different to Peter Cushing. He painted with a lot of humor and a lot of, he was very, very attractive. I could see women going mad for him in that film. As much as Gary Oldman. I love the character Quincy the Texan. I thought it was kind of sad when he died at the end. That was the only thing that upset me in the whole film. But my God, the special effects, yeah, old school is best. Notice how they used models for the trains, for the ships, for a lot of the landscapes, the buildings were models. So it added this kind of that sense of dreamlikeness to it. The things like using multiple frame stops, zooming in on the rows before it wilts, that was brilliant as well. When it's showing the kind of like viewpoint of the vampire has transitioned into shapeshifted. And I will talk about this later on after you've had to the next bit. But whoever wrote that either was Coppola or had a researcher knew a hell of a lot about magic because it's all over it. There's like, you have films that would drop truth bombs into films about like politics or something. Well, that dropped truth bombs about magic and the occult. And I just can't say enough good things about that film. The soundtrack too is wonderful. And I mean, yeah, I mean that scene where and Winona Ryder, what she proved she wasn't just a pretty face. That scene at the end when my time comes, Jonathan, will you do the same to me? She delivered that line phenomenal, and it was so believable. And gosh, Richard E. Grant as the heroin addicted uh, doctor, Tom Waits as the Renfield. It just goes on. The impossibly perfectly beautiful Monica uh, Bellucci as the vampire lady. Come on. It's also a very European film made by Hollywood. I've often thought that about Francis Ford Coppola. Actually, he started his film career here in Ireland with Dementia 13, which is a horror film, ironically. I always thought he was a European director making Hollywood films, if you know what I mean. His aesthetic, his style, very Catholic. The film is very Catholic and other ways. But yeah, I think I do. I totally get why you put that Keanu Reeves next to these two like very sexy men in Anthony Hopkins and Gary Oldman, and but it was to amplify just what a soy boy lameo he was, and why Mina wanted the bad boys, and she even went for Van Helsing at one point.
I just thought, I'm not a big fan of Keanu Reeves anyway. I always found him a little bit boring, and then for him to play that part, I did wonder, is it because I don't like him, or is it because the character is a boring character? So it's a Victorian soy boy. So yeah, he delivered it very well then, because he was. I just found him quite wooden.
A very similar character in The Devil's Advocate with Al Pacino, where he was this kind of one-dimensional Southern Louisiana lawyer, very kind of one-dimensional kind of thing. So, but I don't think he's like that in real life. I've seen him in films, and he is quite. I don't like. I hate the Matrix films and all that rubbish. But yeah, he was the right man for the role. A director of the level of Francis Ford Coppola doesn't make mistakes, especially when casting.
I think it's the Matrix that put me off him. I found him wet, like a wet lettuce in that film. Dare I say it? But yeah, I didn't like the Matrix. None of that trilogy. So that's my problem with Keanu Reeves there. Liked him in Bill and Ted.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
But
No, the guy can act, but I hate the Matrix films. I don't understand why people think it's a deep spiritual movie. To me, it's just a dumb Hollywood shoot 'em up film. That's all it is to me.
when I was putting my review together for this movie, I actually found a rumor, according to an extra that was on the set of Dracula, that during the scene where Dracula first arrives in London and he's there looking very sexy in his round rimmed glasses and his top hat, and he and Mina meet on the street. Well, they couldn't get Winona Ryder to have the response that they wanted when she first sees him. So Gary Oldman allegedly grabbed a zucchini off the vegetable cart that was part of the street scene, and he held it behind his back when Mina was across the street. and then he flashed it in front of his groin and he started making suggestive gestures with it so that when she turned to look at him, it was the first thing she saw, and it actually got the reaction that Francis Ford Coppola wanted. And apparently she was said to be furious and not amused. She did not find it funny, and she fell out with Oldman for the remainder of the film.
That's a great story. I could well believe it. Back to the film, I said earlier on, it's very Catholic. It is. A lot of his films are. You look at The Godfather, you got that a very Italian American thing going on. He definitely brought that to this film. The scene where Jonathan and Mina are getting married in the monastery, intercutting with Dracula on the Demeter, was very, and all the chaos unleashing was very similar to the baptismal scene at the end of the first Godfather movie, where Michael Jr. is being, I guess I think that was his name, getting baptized, and intercut with all the killings of all the mobsters and everyone around them. And that was definitely a homage to his own films. There was other things too. The way I see the film is, and this kind of segues into the magical part, paganism. There's a huge element of paganism in him. When Jonathan steps off the carriage that brings him to the past where he meets Dracula's manservant, right? Or whatever that thing, or whatever the thing was, he leaves Christendom and he enters into a pre-Christian Europe. And from that point until he's rescued by the nuns at the convent, Presbyterian Jonathan, Anglican Jonathan, Englishman, late Victorian era, is in the world of the pagans. And there's animism and everything. He's in the world of the paganism, and this is where he really is. And that's how a man of his standing would have felt if he had went into parts of Europe where paganism was still practiced. He would have seen everything as a horror, even when it wasn't. And you definitely got that. And so the middle of the film, his section, it's almost like he's transported through a parallel universe into paganism. And like it says in the book, the wildest and most mysterious, unknown parts of Europe. It was he was going into the folklore. He was going into the hocus pocus world out of a safe Presbyterian, upper class English background where everything was dandy. And there's also an element of seeking that too. Mina ultimately wanted that. She wanted to be removed. Her friend Lucy, who was kind of flighty and flirtatious, she wanted to be removed of her prudishness. She's reading a copy of 1001 Arabian Nights with the sexy illustrations in it. And she envies Mina, who, not because she's pretty, because she's actually better looking, but because she's comfortable with her sexuality. And that transforms into the thing as the film progresses. Yes, it was a pagan thing. And I mean, what's the line that Anthony Hopkins says, God has made devils of us all, or monsters of us all, or something like that. So there's that aspect to it. I think the reason why Dracula had gypsies as his servants and they were under no danger was because they're pagans. And if you were an Abrahamic, either a Muslim from Vlad's day or a Christian from Jonathan's day, you were in extreme danger. So there's that, that whole thing, like Satan is only a problem if you're a devil, if you believe in the devil, or if you're a Christian. To pagans like us, we don't even think about it. It's like not even an issue, So that was a strong element in the film, I found.
Yeah, Jonathan had aspects of Howie from the movie The Wicker Man. Very, very similar. He came from the religious background into the pagan world, and he was in danger immediately.
Yeah, big time. Now, as regards the magic thing, the way they showed when Jonathan enters the castle, the camera zooms in on the threshold as his feet step over him. We know that's straight out of ritual magic. The devil invites you into the threshold of your own free will. He wasn't dragged in the front door. The scene, and I was quite amazed when I saw this and realized what it was. Mina got when he's kind of like when Mina is kind of like starting to fancy him, Dracula. and she starts doing things like letting her hair down, and her lips get red. She's noticed that early on, her lips were pale when she comes into when there was the sexy Mina is coming out. They put like really intense dark red lipstick on her. Her lips are pouty, this kind of thing. It was probably like, she's obviously feeling with sexually aroused. She's becoming sexually aroused. She's becoming a pagan. She says, "Tell me about your homeland." And he stares into her eyes, and the camera zooms into her eye, and then you see all the blood vessels. Well, that's fascination. That's how fascination works. The person casting the spell, the intention, makes intense eye contact with the other person because the blood vessels of the eye are on the surface. The only place blood comes to the surface is on the eyeballs. So, and then it goes to the heart, and then you get them to do what you want them to do. But that was amazing. And then Anthony Hopkins going on about this Christian civilization, and his German accent was great. And he looked German as well. He actually didn't look English anymore. He looked German, and he makes the magic circle. So you have to. It's like the Market Kirch in Hanover in Germany with a pentagram and the hexagram on it. Sometimes you have to go into the enemy's world in order to protect yourself, that kind of thing. That was amazing. I mean, I could just think of this the Green Fairy, the absinthe scene, how that was filmed with the words absinthe on the bottle, rolling slowly, and he's the Green Fairy, this kind of thing. The opening sequence is probably one of the greatest opening sequences in the history of cinema. As when he kills all the Turks and the Ottomans, and then he comes back and the sneaky trick was played on them, and then he has this like, yeah, goes to war against God and blasphemes, and it's just outstanding. And that kind of like heavy metal outfit he was wearing, it's just unbelievable.
It never went into detail in the movie how he became a vampire. It just said that he renounced God and then he became a vampire, but we didn't see what metamorphosis took place or what ritual took place in order for that to come about.
Well, he went into the dark arts, but remember that Vlad the Impaler is not really the Dracula of the novel. That's kind of like been stitched together. So, and we don't really know why. I mean, the real story, we don't really know why it's stitched together, but they've done the same. Well, we know it's a descendant of him, an ancestor, but they did the same in the film, So, well, I think for the discerning viewer, and Francis Ford Coppola is very good at doing this in films. He makes films on two levels: one for the average person who's a film goer, and the other for people who will know about subjects that you probably couldn't make a movie on, really. Like maybe he wants to make a movie on magic, but he couldn't make a movie on magic, so he dovetails magical rituals into and techniques into the film, just like he did in Godfather 3, which was basically he showed how the Pope John Paul IV was assassinated by the Jesuits because of the banks and the secret unknowns. He was right there. Al Pacino says, "Well, who's behind it?" Again, Anthony Garcia goes, "The Illuminati, propaganda Dewey, the Jesuits, the secret unknowns." So he was dropping that's some truth bombs, and that's why that film was attacked. Even though everything in it was basically based on truth in terms of the assassination thing, David Yallow's book. And he was kind of outcast from Hollywood for a long time because of Godfather 3. And they're all saying it's a terrible film. It is not. It's an excellent film. It's just that there was an organized thing to take it down. But this was his return to Hollywood, and what a triumph. What an absolute triumph.
It's almost Dennis Wheatley-like, isn't it? Because he was another one who would drop truth bombs through fiction because he couldn't write about things like that due to the witchcraft laws at that time.
Yeah. And also, it was an allegory for syphilis, too. Syphilis ravaged. And I think Henry Irving may have had syphilis. And all these impressionable girls and women that he was having affairs with, maybe it's been suggested that Dracula making them vampires was actually an allegory for Irving making the women syphilitic, spreading his STDs. And not telling them. And syphilis was like an awful thing back in those days. And even the part where we were introduced to Anthony Hopkins giving a lecture on syphilis in the medical academy, where he calls it's not civilization, it's civilization, you know, and so that tied into it. You also had that there was definitely homage to Hammer in it, especially the a lunatic asylum with Richard E. Grant being a heroin addict in it, and Tom Waits as Renfield. You had the fellas with the cages on. It looked like a Hammer film at that point. So obviously he was giving us homage. I've seen interviews when he was very open, and he did interviews in the early days. Francis Ford Coppola was a real movie fan. He was a he was like he was like a kid talking about his favorite film. So he's not only just a director, but he's a fan, a proper fan. And you can see there's lots of homages in that film, both to his own work and the kind of classic story. There's a road out movie element in it, the traveling, that's part. I think people always say, and Christopher Lee said the greatest regret of his career was that he never played Dracula in the way Bram Stoker novel was written. And still no movie has been made directly like the book. But I think that's the beauty of the book, because it's written in that letter form and in each of those chapters. It allows this kind of creative expansion of it. And I think, when I first heard that Francis Ford Coppola was making a film about Dracula, I thought, oh, that's very news for him. He's not really kind of a horror director. And I was thinking of the horror of the time, like Sam Raimi and The Evil Dead, that was a few years before the John Carpenter films. But he understands, at the end of the film, you could say, if that was in many other films, you'd say that's soppy. It's a bit twee, where him and Elizabeth are united in heaven, in the sort of like the apotheosis. But at the end, Dracula turns into a god, and so does Elizabeth, because that painting on the roof, it's very similar to God and Adam in the Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel, but also the apotheosis of George Washington inside the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. There's a transformation of him to a god. So there was very deep messages being put into that film. Coppola was saying that in order to achieve a kind of a god status, you have to go, it's that classic thing, you have to go into the labyrinth and face the shadow. And who are the greatest? And in that scene where he's converting Mina and she's sucking the blood off his chest, and he goes, I love you too much to condemn you to death. That was fantastic. The look on his face when he realizes, I'm doing a wicked thing here to an innocent woman, doesn't deserve it. And with all his power and strength, he was still brought down by a woman. But the purpose, he could not rest until he had a death wish. So that film ended really bad for everybody except Dracula, because his soul was returned uh, by his own apotheosis in not condemning Mina. He learned the lesson, and he was reunited with Elizabeth. And any other film, you'd laugh at that. I would anyway. That's why I am. Girls like it. I'm not being very sexist there, but I would, right? I know what women are like. I've been in their company and I've seen them cry at these kind of films. But I was nearly on tears at the end of that, because it was done. It was done so well.
He did deserve to find peace. He'd gone through so much, and he'd been wandering around as the undead for centuries, looking for his lost love, who believed that he was dead and killed herself. And yeah, it was a tragic story, and he deserved the redemption. He deserved the peace, and he saved himself when he said, "I can't do it to you." And as he was kind of redeeming himself and his good side was coming to the surface, her shadow side was rising to the surface, because she was begging him to do it. She was like, please, just do it. I need you to do it. I want it. And she was very happy to have become an undead.
And she rescued her soul by doing that, because remember, the Orthodox priest said that you won't go to heaven. She won't go to heaven because she committed suicide. So she reincarnated in order to undo all. So they were the ones who won, and Dracula won the most. and Jonathan had to go back to England, still a soy boy, and she was never going to win him back. I mean, I can remember when I first saw that scene, and people were saying, "Oh, Winona Ryder's not that good of an actress. She's only famous because of that cult movie Heathers, and she's really pretty and everything." But no, people are going to watch the Dracula film after you watch this review. Pay attention to her delivering the line, "When my time, Jonathan, comes, will you do the same to me?" And he doesn't do anything because he's a soy boy.
Yeah.
You know, he's a cook. He's a wimp. He's a weak man, and we live in an age surrounded by weak men. You know, this kind of thing. So I think that in many ways that film would actually be even more powerful in today than it was in the early 90s.
He was like a Victorian NPC, wasn't he? Who had a nasty wake up call.
Yeah, and he was just getting like Jonathan won't. He wouldn't marry her because he didn't have a good enough job. Ridiculous, you know, like this kind of thing. And yet, at a time of terrible poverty in England, he was at the upper echelon of society. He was just by virtue of being born into it. But you know, and even the way they all seek their own shadow, like Richard E. Grant is a heroin or a morphine addict in the hospital, but he's the one who actually becomes the catalyst to bring in Van Helsing to deal with this thing, you know. And the film was almost like on some levels a fan cinema, fiction cinema of someone who loved Hammer films. Didn't it feel like that? You know, especially the three women, the Monica Bellucci, and the way that she looked like Barbara Shelley in Dracula, Prince of Darkness. You know, they were wearing the same kind of kind of sexy negligee, although you know, so like you know, he understood that. He understood that. And Monica Bellucci was a huge film star in Italy at the time, and she basically took a supporting role in this film. But I mean, everyone remembers her for it. She was the lead of the three women, even though she didn't really say anything. And those scenes in it that are still quite shocking, like the baby when Lucy's carrying the little girl down into the crypt, that she's going to report. I mean, that was awful. You think about what's going to happen. That little girl was going to be brought into her coffin, and she was going to suck blood off her as she needed it, drain her. I mean, that's almost unimaginable, like terror in many ways. Being locked in a child being locked in a coffin with a vampire and being drained of their blood every so often, and then the baby being given by Gary Oldman to the three women. Harper thinks it's a Harker thinks it's a dream, you know, and the mist of the green mist when it comes down, that was just basically dry ice, like you said. There was no special effects involved in that. The blue mist was, but that one wasn't. I think a lot of directors, like a lot of the mistakes that were inherent in the Hobbit trilogy, the overuse of CGI, could be addressed in Peter Jackson's upcoming Tolkien films by possibly taking a page out of this film and the use of old-fashioned cinema effects such as models and stop motion and other kinds of like basic camera effects without using digital techniques, because that actually looks better now done with just edit on the cutting room floor. Looks better now, and lighting and things like that looks better today in 2024 than most films today in 2024 look with incredible AGI footage. There's something about it. You're more into the fantasy. And I saw that in the cinema when it first came out, and I was just stunned by how magnificent it was. And and watching it, I watched it the other day just to get ready for this, and it's even better than what I remembered it. You know.
It's an evergreen. It's one of those films you could watch over and over again and find something else in it each time you watch it, another aspect.
The little details, like the rats running upside down in the crypt on the bottom of the ceiling, you know, upside down. Well, they're vampire rats, you know. And when that part, and some of the things, he explodes into rats. Wow. And the scene where he's the demon in the room, like 10 feet tall. Oh, that was just fantastic, you know. And that's when he explodes into the rats and vanish. I mean, all the special effects were a product of creative thinking rather than technology. And that is a big problem with films today. You know, like The Evil Dead, we haven't reviewed that one. I don't think we should. Well, Sam Raimi used models in that too as well. and camera effects, and it's still today like wow, that kind of thing even today. So yeah, it's absolutely spectacular. There isn't enough adjectives and superfluous accolades I could throw at it. It's just incredible, and it is the best, still the best Dracula film of the genre to date of any of them. It's even better than all the. As much as I love the '60s ones with Christopher Lee, this is better than them, much better, and not just because it was more modern, because he had the big Hollywood budget, they allowed him to interject his own personality into the story, and I thought that was amazing.
Yeah, you do wonder how much of that character was Gary Oldman and how much was him acting as Dracula, because it was very charismatic.
Go on, yeah.
Yeah. The scene where he had to lick the blood from Jonathan's shaving blade, apparently they filmed that very, very late at night. It was like midnight. Gary Oldman was quite drunk. So
Oh, there was another scene that reminded me of that as well, where he's shaving Jonathan, and it's a strongly suggested homoerotic scene because Dracula is behind Jonathan with his hand around him like this, and he's rubbing the safety razor up along his neck. It's very, very homoerotic, and that's also, again, they did their homework looking into Bram Stoker. Also, when Lucy came back, we'll be here for the next year. We won't. We'll finish up soon. When Lucy came back, she was in her wedding dress and she looked like a banshee. She looked like a banshee when she was coming down into the crypt, and also a lot like the Slough, which is the blood fairy, the vampire fairy of the Irish tradition, who looks like that too as well. Now, Stoker got a lot of his ideas from his mother, who lived up here in Sligo, and she survived the famine and the cholera epidemic, and told him all, when he was a little boy in Dublin, all these horror stories that she'd experienced in real life, and that she also told him the folklore from around here as well. So that all coagulated into his kind of civil servant mind, and he held it. He was also, remember, the Golden Dawn, and he was also quite close to Lady Wilde, which was Oscar Wilde's mother, who was one of the great folklore scholars of the period. So he was an interesting man in his own way. He definitely. So, but I think Francis Ford Coppola saw a lot of similarities between himself and Bram Stoker, and kind of, if Bram Stoker was alive today, this is probably how he would make this film. And I think there's a lot of that in there. So, what can I say? One of the greatest films ever made, and I'll leave it at that. And if you haven't seen it, shame on you. You probably don't deserve to have a TV or a DVD player.
I only watched it the other week. You maybe want to watch it again now.
Oh yeah. It's more like I said, keep watching that film, and you say, well, as soon as it's finished, you go, I want to watch that again some other time.
Yeah.
On June 3rd, Mercury enters Gemini and is right at home in this sign because this is the sign that Mercury rules over. Our beloved trickster, scribe, and psychopomp is joined by Jupiter, Venus, and the Sun. And this can give our thoughts and actions a much lighter touch than the heavy and rather static and earthy Taurus energy. And we can all feel more eager to learn new things and communicate ideas, start creative endeavors, and even new romances maybe. Whether they have a lasting impact, however, will depend on our own personality and the circumstances within our own lives, because Gemini in general isn't necessarily known for having great perseverance. unless something is really intriguing and resonating on a deep level, in which case Gemini's nature is extremely capable of exploring something down to the most profound levels. Here's where Mercury's psychopomp quality comes in as the wanderer between the worlds, and his nature is not afraid of darkness and depth at all. So in the house or life area that this falls into in your own birth chart, you could feel a great burst of mental clarity, energy, and motivation to get something off the ground, or at the very least work towards a realization of something. With Venus and Jupiter present, I think there's a possibility for love and money-related themes having a much greater focus now, and the former might also be felt globally. On June 6th, we have a new moon in Gemini, and on June 22nd, a full moon in Capricorn. Both, of course, will get extra posts. On June 9th, Mars enters Taurus. Mars represents our drives, ambitions, and what we put our efforts into, and the competitive warrior archetype. In Taurus, security and safety will become a more important point, and not just as concepts, but in terms of finding concrete ways to create more material security and stability for ourselves. Mars will make a square to Pluto, however, enhancing our ambitions towards power and heightening our aggressive or even carnal drives, which can have many different levels, such as greater charisma in general, going for what we want. But with Pluto, there could be an element of obsession involved as well. Globally, we might see greater tensions, but when are we not seeing them lately? On June 17th, Mercury and Venus enter Cancer, putting our mind much more towards emotional and family-oriented matters than Gemini. Venus in this sign in particular can bring out a need for connecting with our families and especially the women in our family, seeking and finding pleasure in the company of our family or women, and thinking more about our home and how we can make it cozier and lovelier, more beautiful, so that it feels more like a protective, safe haven from the chaos outside. Cancer, symbolized by the crab, likes to retreat into the safety of its shell when things get too hard and too harsh out there, which undoubtedly, of course, they are at the moment. Mercury in Cancer is a typical birth chart placement for many people who can be considered a tad too emotional. And in the best case, it is someone who is very empathetic and in tune with their feelings, but unchecked or exacerbated by certain placements, it can very well be a hyper-emotional crybaby. So the following weeks could therefore be increasingly emotionally loaded for us as Mercury approaches an exact trine with Neptune in Pisces in early July. And these two water signs in a supportive trine can mean heightened emotionality, but also intuition going into overdrive, which can go either way, of course. I'd already issue a preemptive warning for the second half of June, where the Renfields and other usual suspects could go a bit extra out of control. Globally, the very colorful and very obnoxious crowd, you know what I mean, could possibly flare up too. Very likely in connection with June 27th, where a US presidential debate is set to take place. So mark this date as a possible Renfield galore day. On June 20th, the Sun also enters Cancer. It is a cardinal water sign ruled by the Moon and represents the mother archetype, emotional bonds with family, and especially the female ancestral line, one's home country and everything connected with the Moon's symbolism. For example, instinctual, intuitive, emotional approaches as opposed to pure logic and reason. Cancer is not devoid of a capacity for logic, but it is definitely not the strong suit of this water sign. The strongest element is intuition, empathy, and also a very beautiful way of connecting with your own emotions. But this could also lead to wallowing and becoming overwhelmed by our own feelings. Conversely, the warm and loving Cancerian mother archetype has a dark side that can be overbearing and smothering. Cancer's nature needs a balance between acknowledging and expressing feelings, which is incredibly important, and getting too deep into them. I say incredibly important because in medical astrology, Cancer rules the stomach, for example, and eating your feelings, whether this is through over or under eating, or just the proverbial swallowing of emotions, can have very concrete physical and psychosomatic effects. And this is very strong, usually in Cancer people or people with prominent Cancer placements in their charts. So this could be a theme for all of us during Cancer season, to become aware of emotions, but to not internalize them too much, because this could actually be counterproductive for us. We could also find ourselves generally more emotional and vulnerable and easily rattled. We could, however, experience the other side of Cancer as well, that is often overlooked in the more superficial categorization, which is that Cancer is absolutely fierce as a tiger when it comes to defending their loved ones, and is definitely not to be underestimated, despite not seeking open confrontation. But when it comes to Cancer and their family, you better watch out. June 20th is also the day of the summer solstice, which takes place each year on the day that the sun moves into Cancer. Western astrology is basically a solar calendar that is oriented at the sun's perceived path, the ecliptic, demarcated by the 4 cardinal points, the 2 solstices, and the 2 equinoxes each year. And they never change positions, and therefore your zodiac sign never changes either, because it is a cohesive system and doesn't need to consider the fixed star constellations that have the same name as the zodiac signs. This is what totally confuses those skeptics who try to tell you that your zodiac sign is wrong. Anyone who claims that has no idea that there are actually 2 systems of astrology. One is the Western or tropical, oriented at the ecliptic, and the other one is the Vedic or sidereal system, which is oriented at the fixed star constellations and takes the precession into account. So anybody who tells you that your zodiac sign is wrong, they are wrong. Astrology used to be a highly pragmatic discipline related to real life events and the natural cycles, and not some spaced out new age concepts that lead nowhere and have massively contributed to the watering down and devaluing of astrology in the public eye, which only plays into the hardcore materialist general dismissal of astrology as nonsense and superstition overall. And the psychobabble department, the new age stuff, certainly is nonsense anyway. The summer solstice has had a profound meaning for humanity since the dawn of time. So if you wish to honor your ancestral traditions, I hope you have a beautiful and joyful celebration. I will make a post for the potentially difficult days in June as well, of which we have a few. So watch out for that on either my channel or my Facebook page, which you can find through my website, or the Hocus Focus group on Facebook, where I post this stuff as well. And if you wish to get into contact with me to book a reading or just inquire about some general information, please don't hesitate. Everything you need to know is on my website. And I hope you have a beautiful month of June. Until next time.
Well, she may not have the cure for Victorian soy boys, but she definitely knows how to sort us out when it comes to our psychic hygiene. So here she is, the Nurse Gladys Emanuel of the psyche. Who's a good nurse? Here she is, the non-TikTok dancing nurse of the psyche. It's our Sara with the psychic hygiene report.
I've been rereading the Harry Potter series of books recently, and it's inspired what I want to talk about for this month's psychic hygiene, especially from our own experiences, trying to find our way in a world that might not fully understand or appreciate our perspectives. Now, compared to the films, the books are a lot darker and a lot better. And there are lots of allegories and metaphors in there regarding living in a world that doesn't share our magical perceptions and way of life. And another plus side to the books is that the characters are how your mind sees them, rather than having to watch Daniel Radcliffe and Emma, what's her face? I can't remember. Anyway, to use an expression from the story, I want to talk about living as a non-muggle in a world full of muggles, or if you prefer, dealing with being surrounded by those who don't understand or believe in magic. And I try not to venture out into normie land unless I have to. And when I do, I find that I get through it by keeping myself private, not because I'm embarrassed or anything, but more because I don't feel the need to justify myself to strangers. And having to explain is just so draining to me. And, well, it's just too much hassle, to be honest. So don't get me wrong, I'll talk about stuff to anyone with an open mind. But I'm talking about here your hardcore five sensories. If you can't see it, touch it, smell it, hear it, or taste it, then it doesn't exist. You know the ones that I mean. Your antos and decos. Your own magical perspective really is a gift, bringing a richness to your life and a depth and a wonder to it. And it reflects your own personal and unique experiences and insights and connections to the spiritual and the metaphysical realms. And while others might not fully understand or appreciate your perspective, it does hold a significance in forming your identity. And also, looking for validation from others is pointless because not everyone will be able to understand or validate your experiences and beliefs. So instead of worrying about what other people think, just focus on living in alignment with your truth and values, regardless of looking for external validation or approval, because you don't need it. And that doesn't mean living in constant secrecy, isolation, or going along to get along, but it means being intentional about where and how you share your magical perspective. So, for example, you may choose to confide in close friends and family, or the tribe connections that we've made online who share the same perspectives, but being more guarded in a professional or social situation where your beliefs might be not very well received or understood. And besides, occultists, magicians, witches, pagans, they don't go around shouting their business to the profane from the rooftops, and there's a reason for that. So exercise discernment and discretion. And of course, when mainstream society gets you down, bring practices into your own daily life that feed your soul and recharge your energy. Things like meditation, energy work, or connecting with nature, whatever floats your boat, and make it a regular part of your routine. And that is my psychic hygiene suggestion for this month.
That was brilliant. That's one of the best psychic hygiene so far. I absolutely love that. Now you make me want to go and read those books. I'd never really had any interest in them, though I know lots of people I know respect their opinions, including yourself, love them. So yeah, that's great. I love the idea of the Muggles being the sort of the dullards, the trust the science idiots. I counted one of them, an appalling version of one of them online, not me, but he was slagging off Neil Oliver, saying, "Can we actually believe it? We watched this lunatic on Coast." Neil Oliver comes across as a beautiful human being in his videos, and he was a classic one of them. There's nothing in there. So that was a great analogy. I love that. Thank you.
You're welcome. And now we know about J.K. Rowling's views on things. When you reread those books, you can actually read between the lines that she's referring to a lot of NPCs and a lot of wokies without actually saying it. Very, very cleverly written when you got this perspective of her now.
Well, she's obviously a very wise person as well as a very brave one too. So I think I was looking for a reason to kind of support her. I think I'm going to go and buy the first book now and have a go at them. Back in the 1980s, I was exploring the south shore of Long Island, as they call it, in the local parlance, with a very attractive American girl that I'd picked up, which is what you do, and we we're basically looking for beaches and stuff because the place is famous for beaches and that kind of thing, and it's a big, huge suburbia. And I see on the Long Island Parkway, I see Amityville, and I say, "Hey, is that the same Amityville from the movie?" And she says, "Yes." And I says, "Can we go see the house?" And she says, "Sure, we'll drive it down. I think I know where it is on Atlantic Avenue." So we went down there and we couldn't find the house. And amazingly, we stopped at the corner of a street called Sheridan Lane or Sheridan Drive, which I thought was funny. And this sort of like elderly American gentleman comes along, and I said, "Pardon me, sir," which I always do. I'm very respectful. I said, "Pardon me, sir. Would it be possible to show us where the Amityville house is?" Or as I said it back then, the Amityville house is. And in my own Irish parlance. And he said, "No," like that, "no." It was like something from a horror film. No. And the two of us were kind of like, "Oh, what's this about?" And I said, "Look, I'm not a freak. I'm not going to cause any trouble. I'm not going to knock on the door." I was quite young at the time, and he must have thought I was a bit wild or something. I don't know, but I said no. Probably didn't hear that my hair was blue. Probably didn't help that either. And shaved at the sides, and a fringe that was like down to here. That probably didn't help the image, the impression. But he says to me, "Where are you from?" And I go, "I'm from Ireland." And I just watched the film and just saw the sign. I just told him the story as it was. And he looked at the girl and said, "Well, she looks nice. She looks sane. She looks normal." So he said, "Well, for our Irish friends, it's the second house just around the corner on the left or whatever." Turned around the corner, and just like the cover of the book, and just like the poster for the film, there was the famous house with the Dutch colonial house with the famous face with the two eyes on it. And it was painted a different color. It had been painted, I think it was white or cream at the time. But that was it. In a very attractive suburban neighborhood. That part of Long Island is very suburban. And it felt weird. It did. I felt a creepiness off the house. And it wasn't like, oh, it's because of the film. Something did seem off about it. That kind of like this is not good place. So as you do, you go back, you carry on with your life, and then bits and pieces of the history comes in. And I was talking to someone who knew the DeFeo family. Now, the Amityville events happened in 1974 when Ron DeFeo, the oldest child, he was a man, he was in his 20s at the time, the DeFeo children, murdered his mother, his father, his two brothers, and his two sisters, both younger than him, in an appalling event involving a hunting rifle. He went to a local pub in Amityville that was there at the time and said, "I think someone shot my parents." The patrons of the bar ran over and saw the parents' dead body. All the bodies were found lying face down, and found the two parents. Called the Long Island the police department, and they have a kind of, they look like cowboys, the coppers on Long Island. They call them Nassau County is where it is. They call them county mounties. And they came over and found the rest of the bodies. Now, Ron DeFeo had told the police that a member of the Genovese crime family, which is a big mob family in New York, had probably done it because they said they threatened his father. So they put Ron DeFeo in this holding cell overnight for his protection from the mob hitman. And then all things started to not add up. The following morning, he confessed to the murders and said, "I don't have any memory of doing it." Now, it's extremely strange, the murders, okay? Apart from the horrific human tragedy, he shot them with a hunting rifle. I think it was a Marlin. Those things sound like a cannon when they go off. They go boom like a shotgun. And the house sits on the edge of a canal, a very nice, very lucrative part of Amityville. You know, where you'd want to live there. You know, desirable. You have a boathouse at the end of your garden with a canal that leads to the ocean. You know, this is quite common in Long Island that these developers built these houses next to canals that they dug for just at the price. And so you would have heard that gunshot. Those 6 shots would have echoed across across the canal. All the houses would have heard them, everyone. Well, just so by chance, a lady we know, Heather, who I had in Hocus Focus, her parents lived next door to the Feos when the murders happened, and they and the other family members, neighborhood people, heard nothing. They heard nothing. Now that's just, and the police stated that it did not have a silencer or a muffler or muzzler on the gun, and he didn't do anything to muffle the sound, like put a pillow around the barrel or something like that. He fired the rifle at close range, and there should have been a sound like 6 bombs going off in a very quiet street in a very suburban Americana neighborhood. Okay. So that was strange enough. DeFeo, to the day he died in 2021, blanked out and said he couldn't remember anything. And they made up stories that he was involved in heroin and LSD, but everybody was in the 60s. It was the early 70s. So anyone from that period was messing around with drugs. It was very common, especially in Long Island, where there was a massive drug culture in, even in suburbia. So that wouldn't have been unusual. But what's unusual is nobody heard the gunshots. So we'll speculate on that later. I have a few theories. But that began the legend of the Amityville house. Now, because of the murders, a couple called the Lutz moved in and bought the house extremely cheap for those days. For the property it was a bargain. Because of the murders, he was a Methodist, she was a Catholic, but were not religious in any way. They got the house for a bargain price, and the furniture was thrown in at a cheap price as well. So basically, they were moving into the house that anything that wasn't affected on the nights of the murders, such as the beds, were still there. It was just like when the DeFeos were there, the family. So she was a bit concerned, being a Catholic, being a good Catholic girl. She suggested that the priest come over and just bless the house, just because of the horror that happened there. A local priest came over, and it's very well done in both the book and the movie, where he heard a strange voice whispering to him, and he started to break out in sores, and there was just a voice shouted, "Get out!" like this. And he had a terrible experience. Very well done in the film and the book, but I think that scene, added so much to why the success of both. So the Lutzes stayed there for a while. They left, and the book was written. Now, the book was not written by the Lutzes. It was written by a guy called Anson, who never actually met the Lutz. He was basically a ghostwriter, and they sent him hours and hours of cassette recordings of them describing their experiences, and he wrote it down. The book became an instance of I think it sold 10 million copies or something like that. Now, in the years since, there has been, if you talk to anyone now in Long Island or anywhere about the Amityville horror, and they'll say, "Oh, the Lutz were liars. They made it up. It's all been debunked." But when you start looking into the debunking, there's very little of it. Now, Lutz admitted that he said most of the book is true. Now, that's not unusual when you're doing a book of actual events like that. There is a creative license, especially a third party writer would put in there to sex up the story, to make it more marketable into readership. It's not, you have to, people have to understand that it's not a court deposition. It's a novel based on an alleged historical or event. So it's not written like the court reporters, notes. It's not written factually like that. So there would be flavors, there would be floweriness, there would be a creative license put into it, but there were not enough to debunk the story. Now, that's often being used. And let's say, well, there's contradictory things in it. And then you say, okay, well, that's usually a sign that someone is lying. And especially when I found out that the first edition of the book has editorial changes that are made in later editions. Now, that's usually a massive red flag that we're being spoofed or something. But when you look at the editorial changes, what are they? The card that they had was changed, from a Ford to a Datsun or whatever, whatever the car was. That was not deception. That was not the same thing as lying. That was the fact that Anson, who transcribed their tapes, got their car type wrong. And that's just like the Muggles you were talking about in the review. That's not enough to say it's debunked, but everyone thinks it's debunked now. So that made the Lutz a lot of money, and that makes people jealous, okay? And the house has been moved into since by a couple of owners. There was owners living there when I lived there, and there's been no reports of anything bad happening. The story was that there was an Indian kind of like hospice that used to be there under where the basement was. And Indians who were mentally ill or suffering from terminal diseases were left there to die. And then the house was built on top of that, centuries later. The Shinnecock tribe on Long Island. Now, I've seen them, they're a real Indian tribe on the island. And that was that. And everybody thinks it's been debunked. There's been lots of films made, a whole series of books as well. And I remember watching a documentary about it back in the 90s. And it ended with one thing that literally made me go into shock, which interestingly has been removed from the Wikipedia page since the last time I looked it up. But it did happen. Long Island Newsday, which is the newspaper for Nassau County, went in and they brought in psychics and they did a photojournalism thing on the house and they photographed it and all this kind of thing. And they came away and the story was in the paper, but they left the camera, I think, overnight with an automatic hot shoe on it, so it would take a photograph every so often, right? One of the photographs shows a little boy who looks exactly like the DeFeo boy who was murdered, looking out the door of the room at the camera, right at it. Now, that has also been debunked. They say that the little boy was the son of a photographer. What photographer takes a 7 or 8-year-old boy to a haunted house that alleged murder happened in it and lets him run around on his own, during a serious news story for the paper that was going to get them national coverage? It would never happen. That would never happen. The boss wouldn't allow it. The editor would go nuts if you heard that a child was brought in by a photographer. But that was actually on the Wikipedia page, and it's not there now. Well, not the one I'm seeing. I don't know many other countries. So it's almost like the debunking thing that they tried with that failed, and then they quietly want to kill the story. That kind of thing. That's what I noticed. If they can't debunk it, they say it never happened, Or will they make the situation like it never happened? You know, we see that with the needle. Well, all of it never happened, you know, because they can't debunk it. So I'm a firm believer that the Amityville horror events, both the Feo murders and the Lutz family experience, are rooted in truth. The book is superb. The film is even better. And the house is genuinely spooky. Genuinely spooky. And I have not seen, in fact, the Catholic priest at one point denied it, said it didn't happen at all like that. And I called them up from home. I spoke to them on the phone. And then that's just like, oh, okay, that is a major lie. You know, that is a lie. If that's not true and what didn't happen, that's a lie. And then that might have been pressure from his bishop because it made the priest look bad in the film because he runs away like a coward, you know. So I could see his local bishop saying that film has just made our parish look ridiculous, our archdiocese look ridiculous. So the priest won't be called around to anything like this ever again because they'll scarper like your man, I think his name Matuscu or something like that was his name, ran away in terror, right? So he may have been under pressure from his diocese to say it didn't happen. But then later on, he said it happened just like it was shown in the film. So it's almost like he was told to debunk it. He debunked it, and then later on felt dishonest or and it was genuine disturbed. Then he said, "No, it did happen." So that gets almost no publicity. You know, they all say, "Oh, the priest said it never happened," but they don't say that later on he recounted it. So that's proof to me that something is. Look, I go with my feelings and sensations. I looked at the house and I felt like it was going to scream, "Get out" at me too. And it wasn't because I was impressionable or easily, you know, wooed by films and stuff like that. It's genuinely how I felt. And the beautiful young lady that was with me felt the same way too. So, and it's probably why that man didn't want us gawking in the windows because he probably didn't like looking at that. And he probably said, "These are probably two nice kids. They don't really need to be doing that." You know, in reality, probably said that. He probably heard stories of people looking at it and coming away saying, "I wish I didn't look at that place." So the Amityville horror is real. There's something definitely happened. There's too many anomalies for it not to have happened. And that's basically it. What do you think of it, Sarah?
Well, for me, it's one of the creepiest topics that we've covered. And I felt a bit uncomfortable and a bit muddy while I was researching it. And I enjoyed the first couple of movies, which were based on or loosely based on events. But I think the actual history of the story is really, really dark and creepy. And even if the hauntings were a case of being a hoax for money or what have you, what happened to the DeFeo family is tragic and creepy and really shouldn't be forgotten. And my thoughts on it after researching led me to think about, first of all, the history of the land. Did it start before or after the killings? I know there were stories in the book about a man called John Ketchum who was banished from was it Salem or up in Massachusetts for practicing witchcraft in the 1600s. And he moved to the area, apparently, continued his witchcraft until he died, and he's said to be buried underneath the property, but it's never been verified. Is it creepypasta? Is it urban legend? I don't know. And to be honest, after some of the things that I've read about the Lutzes, I'd say it's more likely to be an urban legend regarding the man being buried under the property. And then I read, like you mentioned, about the land being an old Indian reservation and that everything could lead back to that because the Native Americans there believed that the land that's now Ocean Avenue was a power spot and that demon-infested enemies were left to die on this land and then buried face down, cursed to face all eternity, staring into darkness where they lay. Again, plausible, but could be a cover-up for something else. And I also became a little bit sceptical when I saw that the Warrens were involved with the case and pushing the Lutz's story on the TV. And I've never really trusted the Warrens because there's too many TV appearances and money's involved where they're concerned. And whenever they're involved, there's always the hoaxes are never far behind. So was it a case of a psychopath killing his family in cold blood and the horrors started from there? Or did something already there take control of him and make him do it? I don't know. But what is creepier, to be honest? And no matter what creepy stories are put forward by the Lutzes, all roads always lead back to the DeFeo shootings and the fact that nobody heard the shots. That's strange to me.
Yeah, that's it. Anson probably made up the story about the witchcraft guy from Salem. And that's very Lovecraftian. And it happened possibly because he based the title of the book on the Dunwich Horror. So the Lutzes were probably not responsible for that these kinds of, this is the floweriness, you know, that was probably Anson and the publishers sexing the story up.
And another thing that crossed my mind, I was trying to just give it some balance, is did the Lutzes buy the Amityville house out of morbid curiosity, or were they paid off to take that house on to get the story started of it being haunted and cursed in order to cover up something else that went on in regards to that murder, those murders? Because they bought the house, they were in there for 24 days, I think it was, and then they all fled, leaving the belongings behind, and they moved to California to start a new life. Job done. And the hype around the house has practically made the DeFeo shootings like a secondary aspect to it, because people focus on what could be in the house and the haunted house aspect of it. So if it was a cover-up for something that went on with those murders, then what better cover-up than a supernatural one, which has now stopped people thinking about or focusing on those shootings, and again, why nobody heard them.
Well, now you're in the territory that I got me interested in it, because that's the smoking gun, ironically, tragically, poetically, is there was no smoking gun. There was no, in terms of the sounds being heard. That makes no sense at all. Now, this brings us into another world, okay? Yes, that's all that stuff about the Lutzes and the Warrens concocting a story together could be true. I wouldn't be against it, but the house is still has this horrible energy. I personally believe that the house is sentient and probably calls people who are demonically agreeable, like the Lutzes and the Warrens, to it. I often thought that they were kind of like demon summoners, the Warrens, in many ways, that they were bringing these entities in. So the Warrens are dodgy as anything. I totally agree with that. And I often think that they're actual occultists themselves. The house has become sentient, I believe, in the same way in Stephen King's The Shining, the hotel was sentient. I really do believe that these buildings can become sentient. They kind of host an entity. And it may have been drawn in by the murder of the DeFeos. We'll go one step further into the conspiratorial world that you just brought up. Long Island is a funny place. You've heard me mention this before. There's a lot of secret government labs out there. We all know about the Montauk one out of Montauk Point. There's also the Brookhaven one, which is a very sinister place on the North Shore across from Amityville. Now, there was a guy was a famous kind of like pre-internet Fortean researcher on Long Island who used to publish a newsletter and appear on local radio shows. And he took a real interest in Brookhaven. And he started to interview people who worked there. And he was starting to make connections with events regarding murders on Long Island that may have been because of a kind of an MK Ultra type thing that happened at Brookhaven. And they sent him out and they killed people. And he didn't make the Amityville connection, but I did. Interestingly, after he got a very credible write-up in the New York Times, he disappeared off the face of the earth. I don't think he's been found. He either was found dead or he has never been found. and it was only because he was exposing the Brookhaven carry on. So, Ron DeFeo would be an ideal candidate for an MK Ultra type program. He seemed like a weak personality. He has no memory of the shootings, and it's also highly plausible that they were murdered somewhere else, maybe even and brought there and made it look like they were shot in the beds. Or some professional hitman was there, shot them, and DeFeo was given the gun, the rifle that the family owned, and made it look like they did it or something. Something happened. Those shot, either they were not killed in the house, or the gun did have a silencer on it, which I don't think you can even get silencers for rifles like that. A Muslim. So that's the only thing that makes sense with that thing. Also, if you look online, there is a news report of the day after the murders, and you can see it with just the ticker, the timestamp on it. It's in silence, and it was filmed for like a local TV station on Long Island. And the whole thing is some very suspicious-looking characters walking around. I often wonder if they're CIA or something like DARPA or something like that. Also, the house was accessible not only by the road on Ocean Avenue. Remember, like I said, Ocean Avenue. I was at Atlantic Avenue in the beginning. Sorry, it was Ocean Avenue. It was also accessible from the sea via the canal, which came right into the backyard. So it could have happened. Something could have come in that way. And DeFeo, for the rest of his life, said he couldn't remember what happened. So I do think the Lutz, what the priest admitting that this stuff happened, shows that there is some kind of demonic force in the house, right? The story definitely has been sexed up by Anson, right? The Lutz did very, very well out of it. The Warrens were involved, but that doesn't change the fact that when I looked at that house, it creeped the absolute shite out of me, and I'm sensitive to this stuff. I know when I'm in an evil place. And on top of that, the DeFeo murders just make no sense. And there's been theories that his sister did it, or him and his sister were involved in incest, or there was incest going on in the family. Now, the DeFeo family, the front of the house, very common with Italian Americans, had statues of the Virgin Mary and all that stuff on the front yard. And we know all about how those kinds of things, are not often what you think they are. We covered the moving statues last week, and they can be inhabited by entities. But yeah, it's a remarkable story in terms of its strangeness, no doubt about that.
Psychogeography could be another aspect of the area as well, which we know it affects attitudes of people, certain people. So it could have affected that young DeFeo Jr., or it could be that the tragedy there has left so much residual energy, the psychic imprint on that place now did indeed cause the house to become haunted, and all that phenomena that the Lutzes said that they've experienced. It's a mystery. I really don't know.
Yes, it was like the Marsden house in Salem's Lot. The Lutzes and the Warrens were there because the evil houses attract evil men. So there's a couple. I think. But having said that, I still think the priest's testimony, plus the photograph of the little boy on the top of the stairs looking out the door, is enough for me to say there's a real paranormal Fortean element to it.
The Lutzes' children, they were kids at the time. When they were adults, they actually both came forward and said that the house was haunted, and that the father brought it all on himself because he liked to dabble in the occult, and it was him who triggered what started the nightmare for them all. And then the wife said they opened themselves up because they were doing transcendental meditation, and she blames it on that. But I don't think meditating would cause all that. I think dabbling with Ouija boards or things gung-ho that you don't know anything about might do that, though, especially if you're dealing with a property that's got demonic infestation, rather than a spirit haunting or a ghost haunting or a residual haunting.
Yeah, or were the DARPA and the CIA involved in this stuff at Brookhaven? We know it's all coming out now that the intelligence services know they're demons and trying to find a way to use them. They're into all this stuff. We know from the gateway process that we cover in our book that this stuff, they're interested in stuff that they debunk otherwise. the entire files of the Monroe Institute ended up basically in DARPA's hands. You know, this spooky shit. Transcendental meditation can lead to walk-ins. That's definitely one of the reasons I don't do it. Absolutely, it does. And in the East, there's very strict rules regarding meditation, and it's basically you have to build a circle of magical protection before you even start it. So I've always tried away that. I can bring them in, but that level, I don't know. But you know, if you got one entity and he'll do everything else. Well, yeah, absolutely. There, you know, I'm open to all these things. I think this is why the story remains. It's not because it was a great horror story in terms of fiction, the Amityville part, but all the other stuff, everything else is weird about it. And Long Island is weird, and there's lots of weird people on Long Island. It's that they're all people who were the children, grandchildren now, great grandchildren now, of people who emigrated to the United States from all over Europe, were lived in poverty in places like Brooklyn and Manhattan and the Bronx, and then went to suburbia. You know, and it's a very false place out there. It's a very false existence for many people out there. So add to that Brookhaven and all the other stuff, and you've got the Amityville horror.
Is it the transcendental meditation you're talking about that can create walk-ins, or meditation in general? Because I've never tried the
meditation in general. Yeah.
Oh right, okay.
Yeah, that's why I was. In fact, remember when Russell Brand was pushing it? You can leave this in the show, by the way. And now he's gone all kinds of like wacky weirdo. He always kind of was, but look at him now. You know, he thinks he's like Jesus Christ now for real. And yeah, you can absolutely. I mean, the Catholic Church are right about that. You have to be very careful. Yes, I absolutely wouldn't put myself in a state where my psychic firewall could be compromised. And transcendental meditation and regular meditation, it does have that effect in some people. The Catholic Church are correct to be dubious about it, because I discovered in Asia that from amongst themselves that they don't take meditation. It's not this hippie thing that we picked up in the West. It's quite different, just like yoga is quite different in the East. And what we're getting is kind of a pop culture version. So, and also, before I knew all this, I tried meditation, and I found it impossible. Now, and also, one of the reasons I turned off meditation was I used to hear people saying, "Do you meditate? Have you tried meditating?" In such a way like that, if I wasn't meditating, that I wasn't somehow spiritual enough, that kind of thing. And when I would say, "Oh, well, I've tried and I can't do it," and I felt uncomfortable when I was doing it, "Oh, that's because you're not spiritual enough. You're not letting your mind go." And I said, "Well, I quite like my thoughts. I quite like what goes on in my head. And I couldn't imagine anything worse than just scooping it all out, you know." So I've always been very dubious about meditation, even before I discovered that it can now walk and come in.
I think when I do it, I don't empty my mind. I sit with my thoughts and think about things and go off travelling in my head, like guided. You know, maybe that's something different.
But that's not meditation. That's daydreaming, and that's actually a very powerful and positive thing. No, in proper meditation, you literally the attempt is to get into the zone where literally you've shut off your cognitive functioning, and you're just basically in a kind of a hypnotized kind of state. And you know, and they call it getting into the zone. And the people that heard describe it to me said it was the most amazing thing that ever happened. I got into the zone, and suddenly there was nothing. And I'm like to myself, "But you're not really a healthy person. You have all kinds of personality and behavioral problems. What? And you're telling me that I should be meditating to be as spiritual as you?" You know, it's that kind of thing. You know, there's one of those kinds of things. It's ultimately rooted in Western decadence, and also a failure to understand Eastern mysticism and religion.
Right. Okay. Good to know.
Yeah, I think in many Buddhist traditions, people are not allowed to meditate alone. They have to have someone there to take care of them.
But the daydreaming style ones are okay, where you sit there and you take yourself somewhere, or you sit and you think about things.
But that's not meditation. That's daydreaming. Yeah, meditation is like you literally shut off everything in your cognitive functioning, and there is no thoughts. There's nothing. It's gone. You know, And I often think that these people are they end up medicating themselves with it, to deal with personality issues or something, or psychological problems. No, what you're describing, old-fashioned daydreaming, streams of, unconsciousness, is one of the most wonderful and beautiful things you can do for yourself as a person. It's one of the things, if I was ever feel sorry for NPC, is the fact that they can't do that.
Yeah, do that. Do that twice a day if I can. Consciously. Obviously, you go off daydreaming throughout the day and you don't realise you're doing it, but I make a point of doing it to relax and to just churn things over in my head and maybe go off on a little journey in my mind's eye somewhere.
When I was working on Wall Street, and under tremendous pressure, just because of the nature of the job, deadlines and stuff, I used to do that a lot. Before I'd go to sleep at night, I would do not astral projection, but I would actually do it in my mind. So I would daydream that I was floating up in the air and traveling around, visiting different places. And I found it so helpful in de-stressing from the pressures of the work. So that was the same thing, but that wasn't meditation and that wasn't astral projection. That was, again, daydreaming.
Yeah.
No, it's not meditation like the way, the real stuff, the switching off of the mind. That does have its benefits, but in many Buddhist traditions, it's done with someone there with you in case something goes wrong.
Right.
It's also dangerous. You think about it. You could be attacked. You could be assaulted. Your house could be brought. And you say, I do it on my own, alone at home. Well, how long would it be if, we know these things will look for a vessel and you're making yourself completely open to it. I'm at one with the universe. Really. Do you know the universe also contains demons and stuff like that,
How's the weather been treating you? That is a question and a topic that has been producing polite conversations all over the world for millennia. So, are we in for a rumble of Renfield thunder, a turbulent tornado, or in the words of George Formby, it's turned out nice again? It's over to the northwest coast of Ireland now with Thomas for this month's psychic weather.
Well, you're not imagining things. It is a picture and an image of the Mothman. This is an old abandoned railway goods yard. And about 20 years ago, 15 years ago in here, I made a short film called The Curse of the Mothman, in which I speculated that Satanists from Washington, D.C. had brought the Mothman into manifestation in Point Pleasant, West. I don't know whatever happened to the film. It was out there for years. But anyway, the psychic weather, it's pretty bad. It's pretty intense. Was determined by an incredible Renfielding episode that happened a few nights ago. At literally 11 p.m., a whole bunch of people started Renfielding together. I've never seen anything like it. And it's been going on ever since. I'm seeing it on the roads now. So we're coming to the end of May, and we do know that the Vedic astrologers have said that June 18th, something big is going to happen in the world. Well, perhaps, just perhaps, what we're seeing is the Renfielding leading up to that. I hope we're not, and I hope doesn't happen, but Renfielding is out of control at the moment, and I suggest you keep watching anyone you are keeping yourself as Renfields in your own life, the kind of like lab rat specimens I use online and a few I know around the place. But it was truly remarkable. It's a Renfielding cluster, and so this suggests that June could be a very challenging month. And this is the psychic weather with me, Thomas Sheridan. Now back to the studio with me and Sarah.
every month, as you know, we head over to our library and we crack open the spines of the most fascinating and thought-provoking books that have graced our bookshelves over the years. And it's our chance to indulge in some show and tell, sharing the books that have inspired us and fired up our imaginations with the hope of inspiring your Fortean bookshelves. And I'll put links in the description if you decide to purchase the books via the links, and we'll get a few coppers to put back into our channels. So let's go over to the library. And my book this week takes us back to the Fortean old school days of the 90s. And it's the X-Files Book of the Unexplained, Volume 1 by Jane Goldman. And it goes into the paranormal phenomena featured in the iconic TV series, and it is a great companion for both die-hard fans and just curious minds of the paranormal. And each chapter looks into a different phenomenon encountered by Mulder and Scully, like ghostly encounters, reincarnation, psychic phenomena, government conspiracies, and everything else in between. And it mixes the fictional world of the TV series with real-world paranormal investigations and insights, and every chapter starts with an introduction to the phenomenon as depicted in the X-Files, and then it goes into the actual paranormal investigations and how these real-life mysteries have inspired each episode. And then at the end of each chapter, it gives you a list of sources and books and further reading. And the book's full of colourful photographs and stills from the show, and also photos and images of well-known and not so well-known paranormal and mysterious cases. And Harry Price appears throughout the book quite a lot, and he was a very big influence on some of the episodes, as was Arthur Conan Doyle. And it brings in perspectives from famous investigators in the field of paranormal research, so that you're given a balanced look at the evidence, theories, and the controversies surrounding each phenomenon. And it's really cleverly written in that it's presented from both the perspective of Mulder and the skepticism of Scully. So whether it's the possibility of extraterrestrial life or the potential for people having psychic abilities, it encourages critical thinking and open-mindedness, and it just shows you the importance of not being too much Mulder and not being too much Scully either, but trying to find somewhere in the middle. And this volume is volume 1. I'm not sure how many volumes there are. I think there's 2 or 3, but this one, it covers all the episodes in series 1, and it's great to go through and pick an episode before watching it to read the chapter on it, and you get a deeper understanding of where the idea of the episode came from. And more often than not, it'll be a famous paranormal case or a Fortean mystery that you'll have heard of somewhere. So it's a great companion to series 1, especially if you're an X-Files and paranormal nerd like I am. And I'll put the link to it on Amazon, and if you want to get your hands on a copy.
That sounds like great fun. Can I see some interior pages?
Yes. Just move that. 1 second. I'll show you, or do you want me to show this camera, Thomas?
Yeah, show the camera. I can see them. I can see it anyway.
Just
very attractive graphic design.
Yeah. You've even got a big section on the Cottingley fairies, and
It looks fairly voluminous. It looks like a great introduction to the paranormal and Fortean.
yeah, it is. It's good. Like I say, it's a good book to have to accompany series 1. And I may find volume 2 as well.
Sticking with the old school Fortean paranormal stuff from those years, well, a bit early the 80s. Well, the X-Files started in the 80s. A casebook of alien contact dimensions by Jacques Vallee, the famous French astronomer / UFO alien researcher. This is a fantastic book. This foreword by Whitley Strieber. came out in the late 80s, 88, I think. And it was the beginning of hocus pocusy type stuff that like it was the beginning of the time following Whitley Strieber's second book, Transformations, that those who could think for themselves were going, the alien stuff doesn't make a lot of sense. The space alien stuff doesn't make a lot of sense. These things have been reported all through history, not just strange lights in the sky, but the universality of the other world, the others, the fairies, the water nymphs of ancient Rome, this kind of thing. Well, he's the first one to really kind of, build the case for this, that this book, Dimensions, is about basically we're just seeing the new manifestation, just like Crowley said, of what these things are. And it's a fantastic read. I think it's best book written. He must have had a really good editor, because sometimes his books can be a bit tricky. They're not well translated from French. And so sometimes you have to go back and read a page. What do you mean by that? But this one you don't. Whoever edited this did a great job. And that's what it's about. And it's also very Lovecraftian somehow. I don't know why. In fact, back in when I was feeling a bit stupid, I even thought of thinking that this could be actually converted into a grimoire for the summoning of Greys. And because that was the impression it left on me, that even though it was a book and the case study of alien contact and stuff like that, it read almost Lovecraftian. It felt that way. It was, it felt like he'd be talking about water nymphs in ancient Rome, and then he'd say the next thing is though, well, how do we summon them? This kind of thing. How do we this and this? It makes great comparisons between angels, as this to perceived, and aliens and humans, and then brings all that stuff in. So, can I just do I have time to read the foreword by Whitley Strieber? Because I think I think Strieber also sums up what my interest in this topic is. What my interest in this topic is not spacemen from Alpha Centaurus and stuff like that. It's not like that. So anyway, no glasses. There are two things about the UFO controversy that make it uniquely interesting. The first is that it's probably the deepest mystery that mankind has ever encountered. The second is that it's been the object of so much denial, despite the fact that it is certainly a real phenomenon. At the very least, it is a social issue of the utmost importance, because it has all the potential of a truly powerful idea to enter unconscious mythology and dare to generate beliefs so broad in their scope and deep in their impact that they emerge with religious implications for the surrounding culture. The only thing now needed to make the UFO myth a new religion of remarkable scope and force is a single undeniable sighting. Such a sighting need last only a few minutes, just long enough to be thoroughly documented. It will at once invest the extraterrestrial channels, the Space Brothers, believers, and the UFO cultists with the appearance of a revealed truth. This unfortunate state of affairs has come about for one reason and one reason only. Our best intellects have methodically ignored the issue of UFOs for a half a century and have thus left the public without recourse in making sense of the incredible, subtle, and complex experience of sighting them and interacting with their inhabitants. There are two reasons that the scientific community has been unable to address the issue sensibly. The first is that the phenomenon is so elusive that it cannot be easily measured. The UFO occupants, if there are any, cannot be studied or even engaged in dialogue, as their machines are only rarely seen by trained observers who are also willing to make their own observations known to their colleagues. The second is simply fear. Any explanation of the phenomenon must inevitably lead to profound challenges to cherished theories about the nature of the mind and universe and man's place in the cosmos. And it goes on. But that's it. I mean, that's what drove me to want to read this book and now and cherish it. Now this is my second copy. I left my original copy back in America, so I bought it again. And yes, it's from 1988, but with all the stuff going on now, with Tucker Carlson talking about it and it being mainstream news, and the possibility of things like Project Blue being unleashed and so on, which I don't think that the real stuff. I think there's the real stuff and there's that as well. It's the first dive into that, and it's still one of the best, and it's an exceptionally easy and enjoyable read. So, Dimensions: A Casebook of Alien Contact by Jacque Vallee. Highly, highly recommended if you want to go into the alien subject without having to deal with the concept of flying spacecraft from other planets. This is your man.
Thank you. I should check that out. And I like Whitley Strieber's work as well. So he did the foreword. So if he's involved in that, then it's going to be a good one.
Yeah, especially after his second book, Transformation, where he started to talk about his Celtic ancestry probably playing a part in this, and he was just seeing the modern fairies.
Is there any other films along those lines that we could review?
On the concept of aliens being fairies or something like that?
Yeah.
Ooh, let me think. Off the top of my head, I can't really think of any. In fact, cosmic horror as a genre has been woefully neglected by Hollywood and all movie makers everywhere. This is why there's still no authentic film made of any Lovecraft story. There's good homages. It depends on what you bring to the experience. Like, so you could watch a movie like The Evil Dead, and you were someone like me. Well, they're not the zombies were somehow connected to the myth. Just me watching it when I first saw it. I said, well, the zombies in the basement. It's a lot like the Dunwich Horror, and ultimately they were created by the Necronomicon on Sentinel Hill. So I saw that element of it, So, but yeah, I mean, I can't think of one, obviously. I'm sure it does exist. We've been very badly served by movie makers in that regard. If you think about it, a lot of these science fiction good horror films, like Alien, you could easily dovetail a supernatural aspect into them if you wanted. Especially, you look at Geiger's artwork for that film and things like it just feels that way. So, yeah, I mean, the nearest is probably 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was co-written basically by Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick at the same time the film was being made. And that would be a close one. And I'm sure there's others, but yeah, I think anything, we'll come up with a list and do that.
Right, it's time to wrap up this week's episode, and we hope you've enjoyed tonight's journey into the unexplained, and you'll join us again next month. And thank you for letting us be part of your Sunday night. And please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel and Hocus Focus. So if you haven't, then please smash that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss an episode. And please continue to share the show far and wide. You guys are our only form of advertising, and we really do appreciate every view, every share and subscription that you invest in us. So we'll do a deal. You keep watching and sharing, and we'll keep bringing you more episodes, and we can't say fairer than that. And Thomas, do you want to go into our big announcement?
Okay, and to add to this, the Hocus Focus book will be released at the Mysterious Earth Conference in St. Anne's near Blackpool in England on the weekend of September 7th. Myself and Sarah will be there to sign copies and sell copies, as well as being part of the conference. I'll be there doing my bit there with Neil. So you have a chance, might never happen again, to get both our signatures on the copies if you show up and come to you want to come to the conference anyway. It's great, but show up at the conference, and you'll be the first people to see and pick up and buy and get signed copies by both of us, remember, by both of us, of the Hocus Pocus casebook. So hopefully we'll see it then. And that will also be a few days later, it'll be released on the general public worldwide on the internet and stuff like that. But if you want a signed copy, and remember, it might be extremely rare, show up in Preston, or not Preston, St. Anne's, and we'll have the copy there.
And the Mysterious Earth conference weekend is a really good weekend. It's always full of good speakers, and my favourite part about it is the book stands. I usually go home with a mountain of books and get moaned at because I've spent too much money, and the drinks on the Saturday night and everything. It's all good crack and it's a good laugh, and it's just full of really nice, like-minded, down-to-earth people.
And I'm also doing an event in October in Glastonbury with another big name, not Sarah, another big name. And well, you are now. Get used to a woman, and it'll be a really good event. It'll be, if you're a Hocus Pocus fan, it'll be right up your street. And it's I'm not allowed to announce it publicly until it's been announced by the promoters, which they'll be doing next month, I believe. But yes, they reminded me that I signed a contract with them. I had another event, and I said, well, if I'm doing it, I want to control what's there, who the speaker is, and so we got that going. So it's going to be really, really fabulous. So keep your diary open for mid-October. We live down in the south of England. Okay, before we go, Sarah goes into the tarot deck, withdraws a card, and as usual gives us a fabulous insight into the symbols, archetypes, meanings, and applications of that card. So what do you have for us this week, Sarah?
Well, for this month's tarot, I've got the Hanged Man. And the card shows a man hanging upside down from a tree by 1 foot, and his other leg is bent to form a cross, and his hands are behind his back, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. But despite his uncomfortable position, he appears serene and thoughtful with a glowing halo around his head, which is linked to enlightenment from the spiritual realms, where the centre of which was the sun. And a solar disc, such as a halo on an image or statue, was also seen as a powerful source of protective magic for the soul. And the Hanged Man also wears a blue tunic, which represents water. And Neptune, the ruler of oceans, is the planet of the Hanged Man card. And he wears red tights, which are the same colour as the magician's robes, and this could suggest that the Hanged Man knows the outcome he would like to manifest while he's hanging around in this position. His posture is also an inversion to the Lady in the World card, and the Hangman card is number 12, and the World card is number 21, which is another inversion, where one card guides us to sit still and the other prompts us to leap forward into a new journey. And his arms tied behind his back suggest that this is a time for contemplation and not action. And the head and arms also form a reversed triangle, which is the symbol of sulphur. And sulphur is one of the 3 prime materials in alchemy, and it represents evaporation and dissolution in terms of the human body. And it also represents the soul. And as I pointed out earlier, this is why there is a protective solar disc talisman at the head in the form of a halo that protects the soul. And interpreting the Hanged Man can differ depending on the context of the reading and the question being asked, but generally the card suggests a state of limbo where forward movement is halted and patience is required. And I guess it could be seen as the traffic light of the pack. And it's positioned between justice and death in the Fool's Journey, and it signifies the importance of preparation for upcoming change or transformation. Now, on the Tree of Life, the Hangman sits on the 13th position between Hod and Gabora. And with the Hangman positioned between the two, he's symbolically trying to find a balance between creativity and restraint. It can represent sacrifice and surrender, the idea of letting go or sacrificing something for a higher purpose, This could be material possessions or old beliefs that no longer serve you. Seeing situations from a new angle, seeking alternative solutions when current ways prove to be useless, embracing the journey, trusting in the process, and allowing events to unfold naturally. In other words, letting go of resistance and trusting that there is a greater wisdom at play. It can indicate a period of stagnation or feeling stuck, but it may be a necessary pause before any further progress can be made, because sometimes a period of contemplation is the best course of action. Now, the halo of the hanged man is surrounded by 40 black lines, which is a significant number in spiritual and mystical traditions. In the Kabbalah, the number 40 corresponds to the Hebrew letter Mem, which is given to the hanged man card, and the significance of 40 is apparent in various religions. For instance, Moses spent 40 days and nights on Mount Sinai, as told in Exodus, and Jesus fasted for 40 days and 40 nights in the Judean desert. And in Judaic tradition, the prophet Elijah journeyed for 40 days and nights before reaching Mount Horeb, where he encountered the divine. And the number 40 in these stories show the life-changing power of patience on spiritual journeys concerning trials and tribulations and revelations through thought and contemplation, and looking at things just like the journey of the hanged man. And to finish, the hanged man is said to depict Odin, who suspended himself from the world ash tree for 9 days and nights to gain the gift of prophecy. It's also believed that it could be Muzio Attendolo Sforza, an Italian mercenary connected with the Visconti family who commissioned the early tarot decks, and being hung upside down by one ankle was punishment for traitors in Italy at that time. It certainly is a card full of symbolism and mystery.
Odin hanging from the Yggdrasil tree, getting the secrets of the runes, no pain, no gain. Meaningful suffering also adds to the belief, my belief, that the origin of the tarot is Indo-European, and because it contains far too many Indo-European archetypes to be from Egypt or from the Middle East, and it almost certainly, in my opinion, from my research, came to Europe brought by gypsies. It was called originally the Tarot of the Bohemes in France, and that just strengthens that case of it being an Indo-European archetypal book of life. So it's a powerful card. It's suffering with meaning. It's pushing yourself to the limits to become the best you can be, kind of thing. But enlightenment, so like what could often be a terrible experience, you look back on it. Like people have had very bad illnesses and recovered, would say it was the best thing that ever happened to me because it took my head out of my arse. Yeah. It's that kind of thing as well. So yeah, it's a fantastic card. I love the way it's drawn too as well in the Rider-Waite deck. Well, that's the Hanged Man, and we hope you haven't suffered through this episode of Hocus Pocus and enjoyed it very much. And like Sarah said, subscribe, because the numbers that's watching the show is fairly decent. It takes nothing to press the subscribe button and hit the bell. So until next time, stay strange, keep it strange.
Good night.
Good night.
Ginger fairies.